There's a passage in the letter of Thérèse where she says, if you can feel content with all you feel discontented with in yourself, you will be a shelter for Jesus. So can you bear the redemptive suffering of bearing that anxiety for the love of God? Mm-hmm. So the very thing that you feel is separating you from God can actually unite yourself to God.
Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome to another episode of CarmelCast. CarmelCast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. For more information, you can visit our website at icspublications.org. Today we're going to be talking about St. Therese and scrupulosity, but before we jump into that topic, I just want to make a quick note of the last episode of this season. We're going to be doing an episode sort of like a Q&A, talking about Carmelite spirituality. And so we want to hear from you. So we encourage you to, you can click the link in the description below and fill out the form to submit questions for us. Or if you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment there with a question, maybe a question you've had about prayer, about Carmelite saints, Carmelite spirituality, whatever it might be. And we're going to answer those in our final episode of this season. So I'm grateful to be joined today by Father Marc Foley. Good to have you back, Father Marc.
Thank you.
He is the publisher of ICS Publications, and so he has a lot of experience, reading the Carmelite saints, writing about them, and then I think apart from that, just living the Carmelite life. And so I wanted to, in this episode, to turn to St. Therese because I've noticed lately in my own life, but also in doing spiritual direction, that there are a lot of people who suffer from different forms of scrupulosity, different levels of scrupulosity, perhaps. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that St. Therese herself, she suffered from scruples, but she also has some great advice, I think, that she can offer to us, or for those of us who are dealing with that. Yep. And so maybe just to start, could you say something like, what is scrupulosity?
I think we have to put scrupulosity within a larger framework. Looked at from a psychological perspective, it's kind of a subsection, a religious expression of an obsessive-compulsive disorder. And obsessive-compulsiveness is an anxiety disorder where obsessions are intrusive thoughts, impulses, ideas which cause anxiety. And compulsions are behaviors that attempt to lower the anxiety. For example, if you pick up any psych textbook, the classic example would be a person who has a phobia of germs, and that causes anxiety, and the compulsion is washing your hands all the time. The problem with that is it does lower the anxiety, which means it reinforces the behavior. Now, when you look at scrupulosity, I think the classic expression of it would be, the obsessive thought would be, I've sinned, feel guilty, high anxiety. How do you get rid of that sense of guilt? Well, you go to confession. And there are people that go to confession every day. They go maybe a couple times a day. And if you live quite a distance from a church, this can really rule your life. Now, I'd like to make a distinction that you can have what is called a sensitive conscience. And if a person has sinned and they feel guilty, they want to be reconciled with God, and therefore they would want to go to confession soon. Nothing wrong with that. But with a scrupulosity, it begins to take over your life. So I don't want anyone out there in the audience to think, oh my God, when I feel I've sinned and I feel guilty, I have to go to confession. What's wrong with me? There might be nothing wrong with you. It's how is this operating in your life? How is this dynamic of guilt and confession operating in your life? So,
yeah, and I would imagine there's different levels of this. We can talk about the person who's perhaps going to confession 3 times a day.
Yep.
But also perhaps there's ways in which maybe almost everyone experiences some of these difficulties in their life.
Right. The difference between normal and abnormal, it's on a spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
So I would really caution people, if they see this dynamic in their life, don't automatically conclude that you're scrupulous.
Mm-hmm.
It might be a very, very normal thing according to your personality and your sensitivities.
Yeah. And maybe before turning to St. Thérèse, then I can just share, maybe this is a little revealing of myself perhaps, but something that I noticed in my own life that I think, again, it's just like hints of this kind of scrupulous behavior that I think until recently I wasn't able to pinpoint it as such. And so I'm curious to hear your thoughts on it. Maybe get a little spiritual direction here in front of the camera. So, so I went to confession, and after the confession, I was given the penance, say 3 Hail Marys.
Yep.
So I go out and I kneel, and I'm saying the Hail Marys. I say the 3 Hail Marys, and I think to myself, well, I don't know if my mind kind of wandered during that second one.
Yeah.
I'm going to say another one just in case.
That's right.
To make sure that and so this was kind of, I was like, wait a second, what am I doing?
That's right.
So I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on.
Well, first of all, that would be normal for a scrupulous person, because what they're looking for is absolute certitude, which they can't have. And it actually triggers obsessive doubting because, am I sure?
Yeah.
If you're a confessor, one of the best things to do with a scrupulous person is give them the penance and make it very, very specific. Don't say, thank God for the next 10 minutes. They can't handle that. Say 3 Hail Marys, but you're going to say them here before you leave. And that's important, because unless you get it absolutely right. I mean, for myself, I don't know, maybe I'm rationalized as my laxity, but at times I'm so tired at night, I sit down in my bedroom and I'm saying night prayer. Well, by the time I get to night prayer, I realize I said daytime prayer. And I said, am I going to say night prayer again? I says, no, God knows it's in the intention. In fact, for me to say night prayer would reinforce a very harsh image of God. So I let it go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I made just like a small list here, but of things that perhaps are I guess what I'm trying to do is to show people who maybe are listening to this that you don't have to have like diagnosable, like very serious scrupulosity to take a lot of wisdom and application of what St. Thérèse is saying here.
That's right.
And so I think that example of like the, feeling the need to repeat the prayer after, for a penance and confession. But I also have a list of other things perhaps that could be signs of this. And one would be kind of re-examining past confessions, perhaps, of going through, like, was I really forgiven for that thing? Maybe I should confess it again to make sure that it was forgiven.
That's right.
One would be guilt over, like, the first movements. So, like, guilt over, like, just the temptation. I was tempted towards lust. Is that a sin? Do I need to confess that? Avoiding the Eucharist without, clear mortal sin. Maybe just over analyzing our thoughts of like, should I have said that? Should I have thought that?
That is a symptom of scrupulosity. Scrupulosity engenders obsessive thinking because you want the certitude.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Being overly worried about missing your Sunday obligation, perhaps. Okay, it's one thing to, make a commitment and really desire to go, but there's the people who are very anxious about the idea of, well, what if this goes wrong and I don't make it to Mass?
I'll give you an example. Was it last month, 5 of us, including myself, had COVID? It was a Sunday. I said, boy, should I go down and say a private Mass at Sunday? I'm saying, no. I says, I'm not doing this because I don't like Mass. This is ridiculous. But there's that doubt there. So, and I think the real danger of giving in to these doubts is it shapes your image of God. And we become like the God we worship.
Yes.
If you think God, if you do things that feed a harsh image of God, you become harsh yourself. You know,
Yeah.
real
No,
danger.
I want to go into that more because I think that's so key.
Yeah,
And this is
yeah.
really what Therese's
That's
kind of
right.
advice is too,
Yeah.
is how to shape our image of God
Yeah.
in line with who God really is and not with this
Yeah.
kind of making of our own imaginations.
Yeah.
So, I mean, maybe we can just then turn to Saint Therese. What was her experience of scrupulosity in her own life?
Okay. First of all, I think we might want to get into how she became scrupulous. You know, and the first thing I would like to say is psychologists say that what really shapes who we are in childhood isn't often a specific event, but rather the atmosphere that you breathe in both your household and in your culture. And for Therese, the atmosphere that she really breathed was that of Jansenism. And Jansenism was a heresy in the church in France, which had a image of a very strict God, a very wrathful God, a God who demanded justice and the depravity of human nature, and that at any moment you could or you might have a mortal sin. So she grew up in this culture. She went to church. She heard these sermons, and also her mother Zélie was very scrupulous.
Right.
During her beatification process, what was really brought out was her mother was very, very strict.
So this is Therese's grandmother.
That's right. And used to say, constricting the children of saying, that's a sin, that's a sin, that's a sin. And her mother became very, very scrupulous. In fact, she says, Therese quotes this in the Story of His Soul, a letter that Zélie, Therese's mother, writes to her brother and says, Mom was very easy with you, but with me she was very strict, and my childhood was, quote, as sad as a winding sheet, which means a shroud. She had a rather depressive temperament, and she was very, very scrupulous. I suspect Therese picked up on this. So Therese was very, very scrupulous. And there's a passage in the Story of His Soul when Therese was like 3.5, 4 years old. This is when kind of the superego was beginning to develop, where she accidentally ripped off a piece of wallpaper from the wall. She was inconsolable. She wanted her father to forgive her. Her father comes home 4 hours later. Nobody remembers this. And she goes and she confesses this, quote, sin, because she needed to be relieved of her anxiety. So even at a young age, she became this. But what happened was, what really triggered this was a retreat that she went to at the age of 12 and a half at the Benedictine boarding school. And at the retreat, let me give you a couple examples here. At the bottom of the holy card that everyone received was this saying, better to die than to sully one's soul with mortal sin. Now, the priest that gave the retreat, these were the names of the conferences, the titles of the conferences: hell, judgment, mortal sin, the necessity of making good confession, and sacrilegious communion, you know. And Therese wrote in her notebook on this retreat, quote, what Father told us was frightening. He spoke about mortal sin, and he described the soul in a state of sin and how much God hated it. This triggered off a major episode of Scruples that lasted for 18 months. So much so that any thought that she had, which she thought was slightly sinful, she would run to Marie and tell her. And she says it was a martyrdom, which it really was.
Yeah. It's interesting how heresies are often a lack of proportion when it comes to like two things.
Yeah.
And it seems like that's the case here with this Jansenism.
That's
because,
right.
I mean, even, that quote you said that was at the bottom of the holy card. It's like, well, yes, this is true.
It's true.
It's better to die than to commit a mortal sin.
That's right.
However, when it's not balanced out with with
Exactly.
God's love and mercy, and the kind of the prodigal son returning to the father. And so when it's just hell, damnation, sacrilege, like it seems like that kind of lack of proportionality there is what really was in the air during the time of Therese, and perhaps really and affected her.
Yeah. In fact, it's interesting. The word heresy in Greek means choice. Mm-hmm. And whatever heresy is, it takes a truth and calls it the whole truth. Mm-hmm. Yes, we are sinners, but and this is true at the bottom of the Holy Card, but you have to see sin within the light of God's mercy. In fact, a good example of this would be in the interior castle, where Teresa says, be careful of getting mired down in your misery of looking at your sins too closely. And she says, you should look at your sins like a black dot against a white backdrop of God's mercy. And, the devil lies to us by always telling us the truth. He's the one that accuses us night and day before God. He's always telling us, you're a sinner. That's true. Mm-hmm. But he keeps out of our mind that sin is in relationship to God's mercy.
Right.
It's always a half-truth. Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah. So maybe I'll just read a passage from that section of this time period that we're talking about of Therese's Scrupulosity. She says, this is from Manuscript A, Chapter 4 of Story of a Soul. It's page 84 of the ICS edition. She says, the year following my first communion passed almost entirely without any interior trials for my soul. It was during my retreat for the second communion that I was assailed by the terrible sickness of scruples. One would have to pass through this martyrdom to understand it well, and for me to express what I suffered for a year and a half would be impossible. All my most simple thoughts and actions became the cause of trouble for me, and I had relief only when I told them to Marie. This cost me dearly, for I believed I was obliged to tell her the absurd thoughts I had even about her. As soon as I laid down my burden, I experienced peace for an instant, but this peace passed away like a lightning flash, and soon my martyrdom began over again.
Yeah. One comment on that is I think when people read that passage, they think the word martyrdom is extreme. If you've ever worked with an extremely scrupulous person, the only word I have is they're tortured. I laid it down for a moment, and it came back.
Yeah.
18 months. Think of it. If every thought you'd have to tell somebody, it would drive you crazy all day.
Yeah.
Not to say the person you're telling. Huh?
Yes. Yes, exactly. And it's interesting too, like you said, that Therese would maybe experience relief from telling Marie, and that might seem like it was fixing the problem, but like you said, it was only reinforcing.
That's right.
The problem.
That's right. Yeah, because if anything I do causes relief, I'll keep on doing it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Could you say something too about how perhaps when we're experiencing this, when we're suffering from this, or when we feel guilty, we can project those feelings onto God?
Oh, definitely. Who was it? 14th century mystic Julian of Norwich. There's a passage in her, she says, there is no wrath in God. And what she meant by that is we do project our image of God on God. Now, guilt is a form of separation anxiety. When I feel guilty, I feel separated from God. I feel separated from people. And how do you feel when somebody's angry at you? How does that make you feel?
Pretty bad.
Pretty bad. And I think for most people, they feel afraid. Mm-hmm. And if your image of God that you're projecting on God is a wrathful God who is angry at you, that causes anxiety, and you want to get rid of that anxiety by going to confession or doing excessive penances. So it's our image of God that's really the problem. Mm. And with Jansenism, that image was really reinforced from the pulpit, from conferences. And let's face it, and I think this is true even today, but especially in Therese's family that put priests up on a pedestal If Father said it, it was true. And in fact, in Carmel, Pauline says in her beatification process, of Therese's beatification process, she used to get sick during community retreats because of what she heard in the conferences. So it wasn't just as a kid. When she was in Carmel and she heard that, she'd still get sick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And maybe, I mean, I would say there's still Jansenistic tendencies in our culture today.
Exactly. Yeah.
But perhaps even more than that, there can be other lenses, like kind of at the root, other ways of seeing this that are at the root of maybe scrupulosity more today, because this often we get our image of God from, perhaps our image of our parents, relationships with our parents when we're young, or perhaps our priest,
authority figures,
young, authority figures,
sure.
right?
Yeah.
And I would say that one thing that seems to drive a lot, this is just me speculating, but seems to drive a lot of the culture today is a sort of perfectionism. That's really instilled from a young age on a lot of people. And I think that this, rather than perhaps, the guilt and shame of sin, but the perfectionism and falling short of high expectations, we can then project that image onto God.
Exactly.
If I'm not perfect, if I slip up, then I'm not loved by him.
That's right.
And that can lead to this kind of similar scrupulous sorts of behavior.
Yeah, because actually, just on a human psychological level, perfectionism is the fear of being criticized. Because if I'm not perfect, because I need to be perfect so I can't be criticized, projecting this onto God, if I'm perfect, he can't condemn me. So absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, and so we see like really what seems to be at the root of scrupulosity is we're going back to the idea of what is our image of God.
Exactly, that's right at the root of it. Because if you go to just an obsessive compulsive disorder, what's being intrusive are obtrusive thoughts and ideas about things I'm afraid of, and for scrupulosity, it's that specter of God, that specter, that idea, that image of God that's always haunting us in the back of our minds. And it's kind of like, Freud used the term superego. The German is Über-Ich, which means the over eyes, somebody looking down at you. And if you're looking down with a frown on your face, you're always walking around with that, and you're afraid that God is waiting for you to screw up so he can throw you into hell.
Yeah.
You can really see where that would cause anxiety. It would cause depression, and depression causes obsessive thinking, and it just gets a cycle and a cycle and a cycle.
Right. And like we said earlier, the very thing that we think is fixing it might just be reinforcing that image of God. And so this is, I think, where Therese's wisdom is going to come in, is like we have to break that cycle somehow.
Exactly.
So maybe could you say, like, what brought about a change? So Therese is suffering from this scrupulosity. What brought about a change in her own life?
I think it was modified. I don't know if she ever got rid of it. But what really made a change was, even though she believed in merciful love, she never always felt that God was merciful, and she acted against her feelings. Let me give you an example out of a letter that she...
This is from is this from the priest that was writing to a confessor?
No. This was... now, first of all, let me say about the priest. Father Pichon said to her, "You have never committed a mortal sin." And she felt so great. 18 months later, he writes to her and says, No, you have not sinned. No, you are absolved from your sins after you receive absolution. So Therese, in the convent, she had doubts that she was even absolved from sin after she heard absolution. That's how bad it was. Now, toward the end of her life, she's her cousin, Marie Guérin, who is also very scrupulous. It kind of runs in the family, She's visiting Paris, and she's touring around. She's going to these museums, and she's seeing, obviously, nude statues and, nudes on pictures. And she's so terrified that she feels that she can't go to communion the next day. So she writes to Therese and asks her advice. And Therese basically says to go. And this is the advice that she writes to her. I hear you are saying, Therese is saying this because she doesn't know. She doesn't know I really do it on purpose. It pleases me. And so I cannot receive communion since I believe I would commit a sacrilege. Yes, your poor little Therese does know. I tell you that she understands it all, and she assures you that you can go without any fear to receive your only true friend. She, too, has passed through the martyrdom of Scruples, but Jesus has given her the grace. Now, this is an incredible statement. Jesus has given her the grace to receive communion just the same, even when she believed that she had committed great sins. So she's saying, even when I feel I've committed a great sin, I'm going to go to communion. Now you say to yourself, wait a minute now. How can you go to communion if you feel you've committed a serious sin? Well, in church teaching, there's such a thing as what's called an erroneous conscience. And you do not have an obligation to follow an erroneous conscience. A scrupulous conscience is a type of erroneous conscience. What Therese did was, even though when she felt God was not merciful, she says, I'm not going to give in to this psycho God. I'm going to believe in merciful love, and the way I'm going to express that belief is to go to communion in spite of how I feel. And that's basically how she really believed in merciful love, and her feelings began to change. So I would say that bringing it to ordinary people, if you go to a confessor, and if it's a good confessor, the confessor will say to a very scrupulous person, you can only come to me for a confession, which prevents the person from going to confession every day. And when they feel they've committed a mortal sin, I'm going to go because my confessor said so, and they'll stop that behavior. So you're helping the person get out of that anxiety relief cycle. So that's what Therese did. That she didn't act upon her feelings. She didn't act upon her feelings of guilt that she was projecting upon God, because she knew that God was psycho God. That was not the true God. We often say that Therese redeemed us from Jansenism. And I think because she was redeemed from Jansenism first,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe I could read. That's great. Thank you. Maybe I could read a little bit too from that section when she's talking about this. This is from chapter 8 of Story of a Soul, page 173 in the ICS edition. She's talking about the retreat here,
Yep.
A personal retreat she was making with his priest. She says, at the time I was having great interior trials of all kinds, even to the point of asking myself whether heaven really existed. I felt disposed to say nothing of my interior dispositions, since I didn't know how to express them. But I had hardly entered the confessional when I felt my soul expand. After speaking only a few words, I was understood in a marvelous way, and my soul was like a book in which the priest read better than I did myself. And I think this is the key line here. She says, he launched me full sail upon the waves of confidence and love, which so strongly attracted me, but upon which I dared not advance. He told me that my faults caused God no pain, and that holding as he did God's place, he was telling me in his name that God was very much pleased with me. Then she continues, yet never had I heard that our faults would not cause any pain, and this assurance filled me with joy.
Yeah. I would be very careful of believing that from then on it was, no pun intended, clear sailing.
Yes.
For a while. Now, one of the phrases that I think is important here is she says, I dare not advance on believing that my sins of weakness cause God no pain. Why would she dare not advance? That's a real question. She doesn't answer that question. My theory is, coming out of Scrupulosity, I would rather believe that God is a wrathful God instead of being lulled into this laxity that God's is not offended by my sins of weakness, because at the end of my life, what if I find out I'm wrong? So it's, see, the motto of a scrupulous person is, I'd rather be safe than sorry. Yeah. So you figure, well, why did she say that? I would have loved to really have heard what the priest actually said, that where Thérèse really felt understood. He must have been a really good confessor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think all of this was going about, like we were saying, it was slowly changing her perception of who God was.
That's right.
She had this false impression of who God was that was judgmental, judging her harshly, and caused her to judge herself harshly. And through this experience with the priest in part, but more than that, I think through a life of giving herself over to this merciful love of the Father, she was able to kind of transform, or God was able to transform in her this view that she had of him.
Yeah, and also, again, her image of God had changed, but I think we have to be careful that from then on, she never felt the scrupulosity. Because usually what happens is, then when we're down physically, mentally, emotionally, these things trigger again.
Yeah.
All these obsessive doubts come up, and so the reason I want to say this is that people that are listening here are saying, well, she got through this completely, and I'm struggling, and I'll never be able to. I don't know if Thérèse ever got through completely. Personally, I don't think that anything in life is completely resolved. I don't think so.
Well, and this is the difference between her believing something and her feeling something.
Exactly.
Right? And so even what she says there, it's not like suddenly she didn't feel that judgment or that temptation towards scrupulosity.
Exactly.
But she, like you said, she acted contrary to that thinking. So she went to receive communion even when she felt that she shouldn't.
That's right. Now, how many times did she actually act against the feelings? We don't know. 80% of the time, 90% of the time, we don't know. So we have to be careful of canonizing every action of a canonized saint. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, and because she certainly continued, like you mentioned, even after this experience.
Exactly.
It was like shortly after that she went back to experiencing scruples again at different times.
Yeah, and exactly. Even so much so that she wondered whether she was forgiven even after she received absolution. Yeah.
Yeah. So the maybe the healing, what that looked like in her life.
She had good days and bad days.
Yeah, and it wasn't necessarily a change in her feelings. It was a change more in her beliefs, her actions, which kind of underlie.
Yeah, and this is where I think the mystery of salvation comes in, and healing is we don't even know whether God wanted her to be completely healed of this. Because if she's not completely healed of her scrupulosity, that gives her opportunities to choose to believe in merciful love.
Yeah.
Often we are not healed of our temptations to lust, anger, pride, what have you, because it always gives us opportunities to grow in the opposite virtue.
Yeah. And so what advice then does Thérèse offer to us when we're facing maybe a temptation towards scrupulosity?
Well, I think basically we've kind of covered that is you have to act against your feelings. Now, the question is, what can be helpful in that regard? That's really the question. You asked me that question, and I wrote down a couple of possibilities that might be helpful. The first is be careful who you confess your sins to. It's like John of the Cross says in The Living Flame, be careful who you expose your soul to. I mean, when you go to confession, your sins are forgiven, but you're dealing with a human element. If you go to a priest who is either scrupulous himself or has somewhat of a harsh image of God, that's going to reinforce your image. Find somebody who will tell you the truth and is very gentle and compassionate for you.
And of course, in this, I just to stress, I know this is clear, but it doesn't mean someone who's whitewashing away sin
no,
either. So it's someone who has this proper balance.
Absolutely, and able to try to differentiate real sin from scrupulosity. I mean, it takes a long while for a confessor to get to know a person, but no, never. Like for example, I dealt with a person who was, really tortured with scrupulosity, and they come in and they say, I don't know whether I consented to this. Did I have 50% consent, 80%? They're just dissecting every thought, and basically at the end, I can't tell them. I can't answer that question. I'm saying, to the extent that there might have been consent, this confession forgives you. Mm-hmm. You are forgiven this. And as a priest in the church, you are not to doubt this whatsoever. Mm-hmm. It's kind of doing for somebody what they themselves cannot do. That's a good use of authority. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And go to one confessor. This is not me. This is St. Alphonsus Liguori. Mm-hmm. Go to one confessor, which can prevent you from going to other
and
people.
Once again, we're talking about someone who's prone to scrupulosity.
Very,
not necessarily everyone saying that everyone should do this.
Yeah. Be careful what you expose your mind to. For example, books, what you watch on YouTube. There's a lot of Catholic speakers out there that are rather harsh. I find problems with. Let me read a passage from the last conversations where Pauline is speaking to Thérèse, and Pauline says, I was speaking to Thérèse about certain practices of devotion and perfection counseled by the saints, which were a source of discouragement to me. And Thérèse said, as for me, with the exception of the Gospels, I no longer find anything in these books. I think the important thing here is just because a saint wrote something, it doesn't mean it's for you. And the proof is in the pudding. If you read something by a saint, it might be good advice. If it's having a negative impact, stay away from it. Be careful what you inject in your mind, because one of the real problems can be, we have this idea in our mind that if there's an ST period before somebody's name, we will take that as gospel truth that we should apply to our own life. Be very, very careful of that. Conversely, read what is helpful to you. I went on the net, and there's a book entitled Understanding Scrupulosity by Father Thomas Santa, S-A-N-T-A. He's a Redemptorist. Redemptorists are really fantastic with dealing with scrupulosity. Their founder, St. Alphonsus Liguori, it's really their
charism.
Their charism. Connect with the right people. They have, on that website, look at Scrupulous Anonymous. This is part of the Redemptorist website. They have a newsletter, articles, support groups. When you realize that there are a lot of good people out there suffering from the same way as you are by scrupulosity, that's a step out of your isolation, which makes you feel less anxious because you feel you're no longer keeping a secret. In other words, your brand of craziness is normal, and that's always good.
Yeah. So it seems like, to kind of digest some of that, it seems like in part what you're saying is for those people who are maybe suffering from real serious scrupulosity, there are resources out there.
That's right.
For help, even, seeing joining a group or seeing a therapist or like things like that might be helpful.
That's right.
But it seems like the message of Thérèse for those of us who maybe aren't like suffering as quite to that extent would be to try to break that cycle.
That's right.
That's right. The anxiety relief cycle that you were talking about there.
That's right.
By acting in a way contrary to perhaps what the anxiety is telling us.
That's right. Yeah.
And maybe just to turn to, if I could point out a few passages from a couple of our other saints as well. There's a great letter that St. John of the Cross writes. You probably know which one I'm talking about here. This is a letter that he writes to one of his spiritual directees. Just a short line here, but he tells her, "Take care of your soul and do not confess scruples or first movements or imaginings in which the soul does not desire to be detained."
Yeah.
So this is the exact advice he's giving, right? To break that cycle of not giving in. Even though the confessing of the scruple would bring me relief from my guilt, he's saying not to break that cycle.
That's right.
To change your behavior.
Exactly, because if you confess the scruple and it gives relief, also just by confessing it is communicating to you it's sinful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's a really real problem. So I mean that's John was a good spiritual director.
Yes.
Yeah.
John of the Cross talks there not confessing scruples, but he says things that don't go beyond first movements.
That's right.
Could you expand, like, what are first movements?
Okay.
And how does that relate to you?
When John speaks about first movements, what he's referring to, I mean, thoughts and temptations are always going through our mind. It's things like whether it's lust or what have you, or anger or pride or envy. In fact, if there's a passage in the Ascent of Mount Carmel, it's at the very end of, I think, chapter 13 of the Ascent of Mount Carmel, where he speaks about first movements. And he says that these first movements that are always coming out of our unconscious into our mind, they can give rise to all the vices, but they can give rise to all the virtues.
Mm-hmm. I actually have that passage marked if you want.
Oh, fantastic.
If you
why don't you read that?
Yeah,
Okay.
this is from chapter 12.
12, is it 12? Yeah.
So he says, "I'm not speaking here of the other natural involuntary appetites, or of thoughts that do not pass beyond the first movements,
Right.
or of other temptations in which there is no consent.
Yeah.
These things do not give rise to any of the evils previously mentioned, though the passion and disturbance they momentarily cause can make it seem that one is being defiled and blinded. Such is not the case. Rather, they occasion the opposite good effects. Insofar as one resists them, one wins strength, purity, comfort, and many blessings."
Yeah.
Yeah. So even though you might feel in the moment of the temptation
That's
as though
right.
you've sinned or you're defiled,
That's right.
as long as that level of consent that John of the Cross is talking about, our will.
Yeah, and here can be a real dicey problem for scrupulous persons. In that letter that Thérèse wrote to Marie Guérin, or vice versa, she says, "I hear you say to me, Thérèse is saying this because she doesn't know. She doesn't know that I really do it on purpose. It pleases me." Well, the thing is, if you have a thought going through your mind, say a lustful thought, it does give you some pleasure automatically. So you say, "My God, it gave me pleasure, therefore it must be sinful." No, are you dwelling upon it? Mm-hmm. And I think really what happens in real time is you have this thought and you resist it and you go back and forth and back and forth. And by the very nature that you're going back and forth is saying you're resisting it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes we are more successful than not. But what a scrupulous person is, they're dissecting it. Mm-hmm. They get 10%, giving in 20%, and that's what drives them crazy.
Yeah. And this reminds me of a passage now from Teresa of Avila. And I think this is one place I see scrupulosity in myself at times too.
Yeah.
It comes to analyzing my prayer time, particularly when it comes to distractions in prayer.
Yeah.
And this is from the Interior Castle, from the Fourth Mansions. Teresa's talking about distractions in prayer here. Just to like maybe set the stage of what I'm talking about, I can go through a period of prayer where I'm very distracted, and then afterwards feel guilty, as though I was sinful in giving in to distractions during the time of prayer. And it can be hard to discern when was that a first movement? I was just distracted, like you said, over and over again, or when is it actually that I've given in and it's sinful? And so Teresa offers this advice. She's talking about these distractions. She says, these miseries will not afflict or assail everyone as much as they did me for many years because of my wretchedness. It seems that I myself wanted to take vengeance on myself. And since the experience was something so painful for me, I think perhaps that it will be so for you too. And I so often speak of it here and there that I might sometimes succeed in explaining to you that it is an unavoidable thing and should not be a disturbance or affliction for you, but that we must let the mill clapper go clacking on and must continue grinding our flour and not fail to work with the will and the intellect. So she's saying these distractions, they keep coming, keep coming, keep coming. But she says, let the poor soul suffer even though it has no fault in this. We have other faults, which makes it right for us to practice patience. And then she continues saying, let's not blame the soul for what a weak imagination, human nature, and the devil cause. I think that's so helpful for me, of reminding myself that these things are caused by my weak human nature. They're caused by the devil. They're caused by my imagination, and not that they're necessarily sinful distractions.
One of the phrases she uses, I think, and I don't know what she meant by it, but she says, I take vengeance on myself. And I think there's a certain logic that when we feel self-hate and guilt and separated from God, it's almost as if I punish myself, that's a form of reparation, and I will connect myself to God. So even in our screwed up mind, we try to get back to God. I take vengeance on myself. That's not a good way of doing it, but the motive is good.
Yeah. And so what in practice then is Therese saying, like, what would that look like for the person? Say for me, if I'm there, I'm praying my 3 Hail Marys after confession, and I'm thinking, oh, maybe I should pray another one just in case. Or I just did an hour of prayer and I was really distracted, and I'm wondering whether I was it was sinful that I was distracted during the hour.
Well, I think what Therese would say would be, 1, don't say the extra Hail Mary, because that's giving in to that. And you're going to feel the anxiety whether or not I've sinned or not. And I would say, if you really believe in merciful love, offer that anxiety up to God as a pleasing sacrifice. So taking the very thing that you feel is separating you from God actually connects it. I mean, there's a passage in Practice of the Presence of God where Brother Lawrence says, for years I used to put sin between myself and God, but after a while, he says, he made a bridge out of the breach. So when you feel that guilt, that false guilt, you offer it up to God. There's a passage in the letter of Thérèse where she says, if you can feel content with all you feel discontented with in yourself, you will be a shelter for Jesus. So can you bear the redemptive suffering of bearing that anxiety for the love of God? So the very thing that you feel is separating you from God can actually unite yourself to God.
Yeah. And so also practically, so then if you catch yourself dwelling in these places of thoughts, that's kind of your way out of it, is to, when I'm overanalyzing something in a somewhat scrupulous way, I can like you said, hand that over to the merciful God. So turn my attention from those things, which is really self-focused, and turn to God and his love and his mercy.
Therese in her autobiography says that prayer is nothing but a loving relationship of having with a friend. I would say make your thoughts into a conversation of just saying, God, right now, even though I believe that you are merciful, I don't feel that you are merciful. And as an expression of my love, I'm really going to not give in to saying this other Hail Mary, and I will live with this, and I will offer this to you as a sign of my love. Actually, talk out your feelings instead of just dwelling on them. Make that a prayer. That's what I would do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's through that process that we can slowly transform that image of God and relate to him as a loving friend.
Exactly. And also what happens in the process of bearing the anxiety, you find out nothing's happening and you build up a tolerance to it. And that, I think, is part of, I don't want to call it a healing of the scrupulosity. That may never be healed. But you have the capacity to manage it better,
Yeah. It's a transformation.
It is, exactly, yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Father Marc. We really appreciate the conversation. I think there's a lot here. Thérèse has many lessons to teach us, I think.
Yeah.
We thank all of you for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in the next episode. God bless you.